The dust of the plains had settled into the very fibers of her wedding dress before she even saw the man she was to marry. Eliza had traveled for weeks, leaving behind the green, rain-washed world of Boston for a land the color of rust and bone. The journey had stripped away the soft edges of her former life, replacing the scent of sea salt and damp earth with the constant, gritty taste of the West. She was a piece of paper, folded and sealed in an envelope, sent across a continent to settle a debt her father had called an alliance. He had used words like prospects and security. Eliza, who had spent her youth with books and quiet walks, understood the truth of it in a much simpler way. She had been sold. Her husband-to-be, Silas Croft, was waiting on the porch of the only real house in the dusty settlement they called a town. He was a man carved from the harsh land itself, broad in the shoulder and narrow in the eye. His hands, resting on his hips, were thick and calloused, hands that knew the heft of an axe and the grip of reins, but not, she suspected, the gentle touch of a woman. He watched her descend from the stagecoach, his expression unreadable, his gaze passing over her as if she were a new head of cattle he had purchased, assessing her worth and finding it adequate, but not pleasing. The wedding was a hurried, loveless affair, conducted by a circuit preacher with whiskey on his breath and a weary look in his eyes. It took place in the town saloon, the only building large enough to hold the handful of silent, sun-weathered onlookers who had come to witness the transaction. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and sawdust. Silas stood beside her, a rigid and imposing silence. He did not look at her once. When the time came for the ring, he produced a thick, unadorned band of gold, heavy and plain. He did not ask for her hand, he took it, his grip firm and impersonal. The ring slid onto her finger, cold and solid, feeling less like a symbol of union and more like the locking of a latch. It was a brand, a mark of ownership. The preacher mumbled the final words, and the men at the bar grunted their congratulations. Silas simply nodded, his jaw tight, and led her out of the saloon and into the unforgiving sunlight. His wife. Life at the Croft Ranch was a study in isolation. The house was large, built of solid timber, but it was a place of echoes and drafts, empty of warmth or laughter. It stood alone on a vast expanse of cracked earth, with only the wind for a constant companion. The wind was a living thing out here, a mournful creature that moaned around the corners of the house at night and threw handfuls of sand against the window panes during the day. It was a lonesome sound that scraped at the edges of Eliza's sanity, a constant reminder of how far she was from everything she had ever known. The land itself was an enemy. Dust devils danced across the plains in the heat of the afternoon, and the river that bordered their property was little more than a dry, stony scar in the earth for most of the year. Rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of rocks, their dry rattle a sudden, terrifying punctuation in the oppressive silence. Everything was sharp, brittle, and thirsty. The landscape was a mirror to her soul, reflecting the parched and barren reality of her new life. Silas treated her not as a wife, but as a fixture in his home, another piece of property he had acquired. In town, he would stand beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that looked like affection to strangers, but felt to Eliza like a man steadying a fence post. Men would approach him, their gazes sliding over Eliza before they addressed her husband. "Got yourself a pretty one, Silas," one had said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. Silas had only grunted in response, his expression unchanged. She was an object to be seen, a testament to his growing wealth and influence, but she was not to be heard. The days bled into one another, each one the same as the last. She would rise at dawn, the air already thick with coming heat. She would manage the household with the help of a quiet, frightened Mexican woman named Maria, who spoke little English and whose eyes were always downcast. Eliza tried to speak with her, to find some small corner of companionship in the vast emptiness of her life, but the woman would only nod and murmur, her fear of Silas a palpable wall between them. The nights were the worst. Silas would return from his work with the ranch hands, his face coated in dust, his mood dark and silent. He would eat the supper Eliza had prepared without a word of thanks, his eyes fixed on the far wall. Afterward, he would sit in his large leather chair by the hearth, a bottle of whiskey on the small table beside him. He would drink, slowly and methodically, his gaze lost in the flames of the fire. He never spoke to her. He never invited her to sit with him. She was expected to be present, a silent figure in the corner of the room, mending his shirts or reading a book she had read a dozen times before, until he was finished with his bottle. Some nights, he would stumble up the stairs to their shared bedroom, the smell of liquor clinging to him like a shroud. He would fall onto the bed, fully clothed, and be asleep in moments, his heavy breathing filling the room. On those nights, Eliza would lie beside him, rigid and still, her eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside. She would feel a profound, bottomless loneliness, a cold so deep that it seemed to settle in her bones. Other nights, he would not come up at all, and she would find him in the morning, slumped over in his chair, the empty bottle on the floor beside him. She learned to prefer those nights. The cold emptiness of the bed was better than the cold, heavy presence of the man who was her husband. She tried, in the beginning, to bridge the chasm between them. She spoke of Boston, of the theater, of the books she loved. He would listen with a flat, bored expression, his silence a clear dismissal of her world, of her. She asked him about the ranch, about the cattle, about the land. "Women's talk is for the house," he had said once, his voice low and hard, and she had never asked again. She understood then that he did not want a partner. He did not want a wife. He wanted a possession, and possessions do not speak. The final, brittle strand of hope she had clung to, the naive belief that perhaps, with time, some form of gentle understanding might grow between them, snapped one sweltering afternoon. She was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening's bread, when she heard the sound of a raised voice from the direction of the stables. It was Silas, his voice a low, angry growl. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window that overlooked the dusty yard. What she saw made the air freeze in her lungs. Silas had a young ranch hand, a boy of no more than 17 named Caleb, backed up against the wall of the stable. The boy had made a mistake. Eliza gathered from the fragments of Silas's words, left a gate open, allowed a calf to wander off. It was a small thing, a careless error. The punishment was not. Silas held a thick leather strap in his hand, the kind used for mending harnesses. He was not shouting now. His voice was calm, almost conversational, which was somehow more terrifying. "You do not cost me money, boy," Silas said, his voice carrying on the still air. "You do not cost me time." He raised the strap and brought it down across the boy's back. The sound was a sickening thud, a sound of leather striking flesh and bone. The boy cried out, stumbling forward, but Silas grabbed him by the shirt and shoved him back against the wall. He struck him again and again. It was not a punishment born of anger, Eliza realized with a cold wave of horror. It was a demonstration of power, a cold and methodical application of pain. Caleb did not cry out anymore. He just slumped against the wall, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Eliza felt a tremor start deep inside her, a trembling of rage and revulsion so profound it made her feel faint. She had known he was a hard man, a cold man. She had not known he was a cruel one. She watched, paralyzed, until Silas finally threw the strap to the ground and walked away, leaving the boy weeping in the dust. That evening, a storm of a different kind broke inside the silent house. When Silas came in for supper, she was waiting for him, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. He sat at the table, oblivious to the thunder gathering in her heart. She served him his plate, her movements stiff and robotic. She could not bring herself to sit. She stood across the table from him, the polished wood a vast, empty canyon between them. "You cannot treat a person that way," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. Silas stopped, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked up at her, his eyes cold and empty. "What did you say?" "Caleb," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "He is just a boy. You cannot beat him for a simple mistake. It is not right." For a long moment, he just stared at her. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by a dark, gathering anger. He slowly placed his fork down on his plate. The small metallic sound echoed in the silent room. "He is my hand," Silas said, his voice dangerously soft. "My property. I will do with him as I see fit, just as I will do with you." He pushed his chair back and stood up, a towering, menacing figure. "You are my wife. You are to be silent. You are to be obedient. You do not question me." "I will not be silent when I see such cruelty," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "It is inhuman." The slap came so fast she did not see it. One moment she was standing, defiant. The next, her head snapped to the side, and a starburst of pain exploded across her cheek. The shock of it was as sharp as the sting. Her eyes filled with tears, more from surprise than from the pain itself. She brought a trembling hand to her face, the skin already hot and swelling. He grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You have forgotten your place," he hissed, his face close to hers, his breath sour with whiskey. "I will remind you of it." He dragged her from the room, her feet stumbling to keep up with his long, angry strides. He pulled her through the kitchen and wrenched open a heavy wooden door she had never seen him use. It led down a set of steep, stone steps into darkness. The air that rose up to meet them was cool and smelled of damp earth and rotting potatoes. The cellar. He shoved her forward, and she stumbled down the first few steps, catching herself on the rough stone wall to keep from falling. "You will stay here until you learn to hold your tongue," he said from the top of the stairs. Then he slammed the door shut. The world plunged into absolute blackness. She heard the heavy metallic sound of a bolt sliding into place, and then silence. Only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic, terrified beating of her heart in the cold. Suffocating dark. Days dissolved into a timeless stretch of darkness and fear. He brought her food once a day, a piece of stale bread and a tin cup of water. Left at the top of the stairs when he came to check the bolt. He never spoke. She lost track of time, measuring the hours by the sliver of light that appeared under the door in the morning and vanished at night. She spent her time huddled in a corner, wrapped in a thin shawl, the cold of the stone floor seeping into her bones, the pain in her cheek faded, replaced by a deep, purple bruise, but the humiliation of the blow, the terror of her imprisonment, burned deeper. In that damp darkness, something inside her shifted. The fragile, well-mannered girl from Boston began to crumble, and in her place, something harder, something more primal, began to form. It was a single, desperate thought. Survival. Not survival within the walls of this marriage, but survival away from it. The cellar did not break her. It forged her resolve. On what she believed was the fourth day. The bolt was not thrown with its usual finality. She heard Silas's heavy footsteps retreat, his mind, she guessed, clouded by drink and preoccupied with the business of the ranch. He had grown careless, confident that her spirit was broken. She waited for what felt like an hour, her ear pressed to the cold wood of the door, listening to the silence of the house. Then, with a trembling hand, she pushed. The door creaked open. Freedom was a blinding square of light in the kitchen. She crept up the stairs, her heart a wild bird in her chest. The house was empty. Through the window, she could see Silas on horseback, riding out toward the far pastures with two of his men. It was her chance. She did not think, she only acted. She grabbed a half-empty canteen of water from a peg by the door and a small loaf of bread from the pantry. She ran from the house, not toward the road, but toward the unforgiving, sun-baked hills that rose up behind the ranch. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, her worn house shoes slipping on the loose rock. The sun beat down on her head, merciless and white-hot. Her dress, a fine blue cotton meant for quiet afternoons, was torn by thorny bushes. Her skin was scratched and bleeding. Thirst became a fire in her throat. By late afternoon, she was delirious, stumbling through a landscape of rock and heat and shimmering air. The world had become a blur of brown and ochre. The silence was absolute, broken only by her own harsh, rasping breaths. She had escaped the cellar, but she had traded one prison for another, a vast, open-air cage with the sun as its warden. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, her body finally gave out. She had reached the edge of a small canyon, its depths already lost in shadow. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees on the hard, cracked earth. The canteen was empty. The bread was long gone. There was nothing left inside her. No strength, no tears, no hope. She lay down on the cooling ground, her bruised cheek pressed against the stone. She looked up at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Faint diamond chips scattered across an endless canvas of velvet. A strange sense of peace washed over her. She had failed. She would die here, but it would be a death of her own choosing. In a way, a death under the open sky. Not in the suffocating darkness of that house. Not under the heavy hand of that man. She closed her eyes, and with her last wisp of consciousness, she whispered a final, broken prayer. Not for rescue, but for release. "Let me die here," she breathed to the silent, watching stars. "Please, just let me die here." He found her the way a man in that country finds most things, by chance, while looking for something else. Luke was tracking a stray steer, one that had broken through a weak spot in the fence line near the canyon rim. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, and he was thinking of water, of shade, of the cool stone of his cabin floor. His horse, a steady buckskin named Dust, nickered softly and shied away from a heap of blue cotton crumpled near a cluster of sagebrush. At first, he thought it was a discarded blanket, but then he saw the pale, slender hand, fingers curled loosely in the red dirt. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth, the jingle of his spurs a sharp, metallic sound in the profound silence. Up close, he could see she was barely a woman, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with the dried salt of tears. A dark, ugly bruise marred one cheek, a violent purple against the deathly pallor of her skin. Her lips were cracked and blue, and the breath that rattled between them was a shallow, desperate whisper. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her face. He touched his fingers to her neck. The pulse was there, a faint, frantic bird beating against his calloused skin. It was a miracle she was alive at all. Without a second thought, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of grain, a fragile collection of bones and desperation. He carried her to his horse, settled her in front of him in the saddle, and turned Dust for home. She was unconscious the whole way, her head lolling against his chest, her breath a warm, faint puff against his dusty shirt. He held her steady, his movements sure and practiced, his face a mask of grim focus. He had seen death in many forms, on battlefields littered with blue and gray, in the vacant eyes of men lost to fever, in the stark, final stillness of a lynched man swinging from a tree. He would not let it take this woman. Not here, not today. His cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods near a spring that ran cool and clear even in the driest months. It was a place of solitude, a fortress against a world he had long since turned his back on. He carried her inside and laid her gently on his own narrow cot. the only bed in the one-room dwelling. For a long while, he just stood over her, a rugged, silent man with sun-worn skin and quiet gray eyes that had seen too much. He saw the fine quality of her torn dress, the softness of her hands, now scratched and raw. He saw the heavy gold band on her left ring finger. A wife, a runaway, trouble, of the worst kind. He pushed the thought aside. She was a human being, dying on his land. The rest did not matter. He worked with a quiet efficiency that was born of a life lived alone. He brought a basin of cool water from the spring and gently washed the dirt from her face and hands. He treated her wounds, dabbing at the cuts and scrapes with a clean cloth. He held a cup of water to her lips, and she moaned, swallowing instinctively. He did not try to give her more. He knew better. He simply sat in a wooden chair beside the cot, a sentinel in the dim light, and waited for the fever to break. Eliza drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if swimming up from a deep, dark well. Her first awareness was of coolness on her forehead, a damp cloth that smelled of clean earth and herbs. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep weariness. She tried to open her eyes, but the light was a sharp pain, and she let them fall closed again. Fear, cold and familiar, began to prick at the edges of her mind. Where was she? Had Silas found her? Had he dragged her back to the cellar? She forced her eyes open again, blinking until the room came into focus. It was small and sparsely furnished. The walls were rough logs, the floor was swept planking. A stone fireplace stood cold against one wall. Through a single, small window, she could see the shifting green leaves of a tree. This was not Silas's house. This was not the cellar. A man sat in a chair near her bed. His head bowed as he stitched a piece of leather strapping. He was lean and weathered, his hair the color of sun-bleached prairie grass. He looked up, sensing her gaze, and his gray eyes met hers. There was no menace in them, no coldness. There was only a quiet, steady watchfulness. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. He put down his leatherwork and came to her side. "You've been sleeping for 2 days. You need to drink." He held the cup to her lips again, and this time she drank greedily. The cool water a balm to her parched throat. He supported her head with a gentle hand, his touch firm but not rough. When she was finished, he laid her head back on the pillow. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Name's Luke," he said. "This is my place." He did not offer any more. He did not ask her name, or where she had come from, or why she was half dead in the middle of the desert. He simply accepted her presence as a fact, like the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. His quiet kindness was so alien to her that it was almost frightening. She did not know how to respond to it, so she said nothing. Over the next few days, her strength began to return in small, hesitant increments. Luke tended to her with a distant but unwavering care. He would bring her broth, a thin, savory soup that was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. He would change the bandages on her cuts and check the angry bruise on her cheek without comment. He moved with a slight limp, she noticed, favoring his left leg, a subtle, constant reminder of some old injury. A war wound, she suspected, from the stories her father used to tell. As she grew stronger, she began to watch him, to learn the rhythms of his solitary life. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet and purposeful. He would light the fire, put the coffee on to boil, and then head out to the small corral to see to his horse. He was a man who lived in harmony with his surroundings, efficient, respectful, and profoundly alone. He spoke little, but his silence was not an empty one. It was a comfortable, self-contained silence, the silence of a man at peace with his own company. She saw no cruelty in him. He was gentle with his horse, murmuring to it as he brushed its coat. He was patient with the small vegetable garden he kept behind the cabin. He moved through his world with a competence and a calm that slowly, day by day, began to soothe the raw, frayed edges of her soul. For the first time since she had arrived in this harsh, unforgiving land, she felt something other than fear. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, but she thought it might be safety. She let her guard down, one painful inch at a time. When she was finally strong enough to leave the cot and walk around the small cabin, she felt a desperate need to repay him, to prove that she was not just a burden. She began with small things. She washed the few dishes he used, tidied the already neat space, and learned to cook with the simple provisions he kept: flour, beans, salted meat. He would come in from his work and find a simple meal waiting for him, and he would nod his thanks, a flicker of something like surprise in his quiet eyes. One afternoon, when she felt her strength had fully returned, she knew she could not put it off any longer. She had to offer him the only thing of value she possessed. She found him by the corral, mending a leather bridle. She stood before him, her hands twisting in the folds of the simple calico dress he had given her to wear, one that had belonged, he had said in a rare moment of explanation, to his sister. "Mr. Hunter," she began, her voice formal. "Luke," he corrected her, not looking up from his work. "Luke," she repeated softly. I have no way to thank you for what you have done. You saved my life." He looked up then, his gray eyes meeting hers. "A man doesn't need thanks for pulling a dog out of a well." "I am not a dog, and this was not a well," she said, a hint of her old spirit returning. "I want to pay you for your trouble, for the food, for the shelter." She held out her left hand, the heavy gold ring catching the afternoon sun. "This is all I have. It is worth something. I think—" He looked at the ring, then back at her face. His expression was unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. He put down the bridle and wiped his hands on his trousers. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, an involuntary reaction born of long, painful experience. His eyes softened. He gently took her hand, but he did not take the ring. His calloused fingers were warm against hers. "I don't want your ring," he said, his voice low and firm. He looked at the gold band, a symbol of a life she was running from. "I didn't save you for payment." He did not let go of her hand. Instead, he drew her closer, his other hand coming up to rest on her waist. He was not rough, not demanding. His touch was a question, a gentle invitation. She stood, frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. He pulled her against him, into a soft, hesitant embrace. She was stiff at first, unused to a man's touch that did not come with a threat, but he just held her, his arms a circle of warmth and strength around her. He rested his cheek against the top of her head. "I only saved you to hold you like this," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. In his arms, something inside Eliza that had been frozen with fear and loneliness for months began to thaw. She leaned into him, her body finally relaxing, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she did not feel like property. She felt like a woman being held. The embrace changed everything. The unspoken tension that had existed between them, the careful distance they had maintained, dissolved into a new, more complicated intimacy. She began to help him with the chores around the small ranch. He taught her how to feed the chickens, how to milk his single, placid cow. He taught her how to ride, not on a delicate side saddle like she was used to, but astride the horse, like a man. At first, she was clumsy and afraid, but Luke was a patient teacher. He would walk beside her, his hand on the horse's bridle, his voice a calm, steady presence. Soon, she found a thrill in the freedom of it, the wind in her hair, the powerful animal moving beneath her. She was learning a new way to live, a new way to be. The nights were the most charged. They would sit by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The world outside would be dark and silent, and the small cabin would feel like the only safe place on earth. It was in these quiet moments that Luke finally began to speak of his past. He told her about his younger brother, Thomas. They had grown up together, inseparable. When the war came, they had fought side by side, but it was not the war that had taken Thomas. It was the law. After they came home, Thomas had been accused of rustling cattle, a charge brought by a powerful rancher who wanted his land. The town sheriff, a man in the pocket of the rancher, had arrested him. There was no real evidence, just the word of one man against another. But in that town, a rich man's word was gospel. They didn't even give him a proper trial, Luke said, his voice flat and hard, his eyes fixed on the fire. The sheriff rounded up a few men, drunk on whiskey and self-righteousness. They hanged him from the big oak tree in the center of town. He fell silent, the pain of the memory a raw, open wound in the small, warm room. I was away, selling horses, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. By the time I got back, it was over. They told me he was a thief, but I knew my brother. He was the most honest man I ever knew. He looked at her then, his gray eyes filled with a grief so profound it made her ache. I left that town. I left that world. I came out here where the only law is the one you make for yourself. I have not been back since. She understood then his silence, his isolation, his deep distrust of the world of men and their cruel, arbitrary justice. He had built this small, solitary life as a shield against the pain of a world that had betrayed him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a simple gesture of comfort. He did not pull away. They sat there for a long time, the fire crackling between them. Two wounded souls finding a strange, fragile comfort in the shared darkness. But the world they had both tried to escape was not as far away as they thought. One day, a man who worked for Luke, a part-time hand named Jeb, who helped with the branding and seasonal work, rode in from town with a wagon of supplies. He was a shifty, nervous man with eyes that never quite met yours. He unloaded the sacks of flour and coffee, his gaze darting around the clearing. And then he saw Eliza, who was feeding the chickens near the cabin. He froze, his eyes widening in recognition. He had seen the posters that Silas had put up all over the county. Missing, they said, wife of Silas Croft, prone to fits of delusion. A generous reward for any information leading to her safe return. Jeb looked from Eliza's face to the poster he had seen nailed to the saloon door, and he knew. Eliza saw the look on his face, and a cold dread washed over her. She turned and went back inside the cabin, her hands trembling. Jeb said nothing. He finished unloading the supplies, took the pay Luke gave him, and tipped his hat. "See you in the spring, Luke," he said, his voice a little too casual. He climbed back on his wagon and rode away, whistling a tuneless, jaunty air. Luke watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He had seen the way Jeb had looked at Eliza. He had seen the flicker of greed in the man's eyes. That night, as they sat by the fire, the comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a new, heavy tension. The world was coming for them. He knew it, and she knew it. The small, safe world they had built in the shadow of the canyon was about to be broken. For now, the man who had recognized her stayed quiet. But for how long? A bounty had been placed on her return. And in this land, a man's loyalty could be bought for the price of a few gold coins. The quiet rhythm of their days was shattered by a trip to town. Luke had put it off for as long as he could, but their supplies were running low, and he needed salt for the cow and fresh shot for his rifle. He hated the town, a place of ghosts and bad memories, but necessity forced his hand. He left at dawn, his face set in a grim line, telling Eliza he would be back by nightfall. The hours she spent alone in the cabin were the longest of her life. The familiar, comfortable silence was gone, replaced by an anxious, listening quiet. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through her. He returned just as the sun was sinking below the horizon. painting the sky in angry strokes of red and purple. She saw from the moment he dismounted that something was wrong. The weariness in his face was deeper than just the fatigue of a long ride. It was a cold, hard anger that tightened his jaw and shadowed his eyes. He said nothing as he unsaddled Dust and led him to the corral. He came into the cabin, dropped a sack of supplies on the table, and finally looked at her. "They're looking for you," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A posse. Your husband is offering a reward." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She sank onto a nearby stool, her hands clutching the rough wood of the table for support. "A posse?" she whispered. "He's telling everyone you lost your mind," Luke continued, his voice low and laced with contempt. "That you've gone mad. He's painting himself as the worried husband, just trying to bring his poor, sick wife home." Luke paced the small space, his limp more pronounced than usual. "Then there's the other story, the one the men are telling in the saloon." He stopped and looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "He's telling them you ran off with another man." A hot, bitter wave of shame and fury washed over Eliza. It was a lie of such perfect, calculated cruelty. Silas was not just trying to find her, he was destroying her. He was stripping her of her sanity, her dignity, her very name. In the eyes of the world, she was no longer a victim. She was either a madwoman or a harlot. No one would help her. No one would believe her. The cage he had built for her was not just the ranch or the cellar. It was the whole world. "So they will hunt me," she said, her voice a hollow echo of itself. "Like an animal." "They will," Luke confirmed, his voice grim. A terrible conflict tore through her. For weeks, this small cabin, this quiet man, had been her entire world, a sanctuary she had begun to believe was real. But it was a fragile illusion. Her presence here was a danger, a plague she had brought to the one person who had shown her kindness. The thought of Silas's men arriving here, of bringing their violence and ugliness into Luke's peaceful solitude, was unbearable. Guilt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. She had to leave. She had to protect him. But the thought of leaving was a physical pain, a tearing sensation in her chest. To step outside the protective circle of this small homestead would be to return to the terror, the loneliness, the utter hopelessness she had felt in the desert. To leave Luke would be to leave the only gentleness, the only safety she had ever known. She was trapped, caught between two impossible choices: endanger the man who had saved her, or return to the wilderness that would surely kill her. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken fears. They ate their simple supper in silence, the clink of their forks against the tin plates unnaturally loud. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it offered little warmth against the chill that had settled between them. Eliza could feel Luke's eyes on her, his gaze steady and questioning, but she could not bring herself to meet it. She felt like a fraud, a liar. He had saved her, sheltered her, and he did not even know the full truth of who or what he was protecting. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She stood up and went to the fireplace, her back to him, staring into the mesmerizing dance of the flames. "You should not have helped me," she said, her voice trembling. "You should have left me where you found me." She heard him push his chair back and come to stand behind her. He did not touch her, but she could feel his presence, a solid warmth in the cold room. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice soft. "I have brought you nothing but trouble," she said, tears welling in her eyes, hot and shameful. "These men, they are not good men. They will not hesitate to harm you to get to me. You do not know my husband." "Then tell me," he said, his voice a low command. "Tell me everything." And so she did. The words came tumbling out, a torrent of pain and humiliation that she had held inside for so long. She told him about the cold, transactional nature of her marriage, about being sold to settle a family debt. She described the public humiliation, the way Silas treated her like a prized mare he was showing off at a fair. She spoke of the long, silent nights, of his drinking, of the profound, crushing loneliness that had been her only companion. Her voice broke as she recounted the story of the young ranch hand, Caleb, and the brutal, senseless beating she had witnessed. "When I spoke up for him," she whispered, her voice cracking, "when I told him it was wrong, he hit me." She touched her cheek, the phantom sting of the blow still a vivid memory. "And he locked me in the cellar, for days, in the dark, because I dared to have a voice." She turned to face him then, the tears finally streaming down her face, her body shaking with the force of her confession. "So you see, I am not a mad woman, and I did not run off with another man. I ran for my life. I ran because I would rather die under the open sky than live another day as his possession. I want to live for myself. Luke, just once, I want to choose my own path." Luke's face was a study in stillness, but his eyes were a storm of emotions. He listened to her story without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. He saw not the fragile, broken woman she thought herself to be, but a woman of incredible strength, a woman who had walked through fire and had not been consumed. When she finished, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire and the ragged sound of her own breathing. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His touch was so tender it made her gasp. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding, a shared knowledge of pain and injustice. He had built a fortress around his heart, a wall to keep out the cruelty of the world, and in that moment, she realized that she had, with her story, walked straight through his defenses. He was not just seeing her, he was seeing his brother, Thomas. He was seeing the same brutal arrogance, the same abuse of power that had stolen everything from him. He took a step closer, his hands coming up to frame her face. He was not the distant, quiet man she had first known. He was a man moved, a man whose carefully constructed solitude had been breached by a woman's desperate courage. They stood there, caught in a moment suspended in time, the firelight flickering across their faces. The air was thick with everything that had been said, and everything that had not. She was no longer just a woman he had rescued. She was Eliza, and he was no longer just her savior. He was Luke. He lowered his head, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. But she did not move. She stood, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes locked on his. She wanted this, she wanted him. Their first kiss was not a thing of passion, but of solace. It was slow and trembling, a quiet affirmation in a world that had offered them nothing but pain. His lips were soft, hesitant, a stark contrast to the rough texture of his sun-worn skin. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palms. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loneliness, of a desperate human need for connection. It was a promise, made in the flickering firelight, to stand against the darkness together. When they finally broke apart, the sun had long since set, leaving the world outside in darkness. But inside the small cabin, a new light had been kindled. The kiss, the confession, had changed the very air they breathed. Luke was no longer just sheltering a runaway. He was protecting Eliza, and his protection would not be passive. The next morning, he was a man transformed. The quiet resignation in his eyes had been replaced by a steely determination. "He will not have you," Luke said, his voice a low, firm promise. "We will not let him." He began to make plans, his mind sharp and focused. He knew a man, an old friend from his army days, who lived 2 counties over, near the mountains, a man named Eli who could be trusted, who owed Luke a debt, and who asked no questions. "Eli can get you papers," Luke explained, spreading a worn map on the table. "A new name. He can put you on a stagecoach heading west to California. You can disappear, start a new life where no one knows your name. The plan was a lifeline, a tangible path out of the nightmare, but it came with a sharp, piercing pain. It meant leaving him. It meant saying goodbye to the only safety, the only kindness she had ever known in this land. She looked at him, at his serious face bent over the map, and a wave of desolation washed over her. But she pushed it down. This was her only chance, his only chance to be free of her. They spent the next day preparing. Luke gathered what little money he had saved, packed a small bag with provisions, and made sure his rifle was clean and loaded. Eliza mended his spare shirt, her fingers working the needle with a frantic energy, her mind a whirl of hope and sorrow. The plan was to leave before dawn the next day, to get a full day's head start before anyone realized they were gone. But they had already waited too long. As dusk fell, casting long, deep shadows across the clearing, Luke was in the corral, giving Dust a final ration of oats. Eliza was inside the cabin, wrapping bread and dried meat in a cloth. A sudden, frantic whinny from the horse made her look up. She went to the window. In the fading light, she saw them. 3 riders, emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing. They were not lawmen. They were hard-faced men with rifles held ready, their eyes scanning the small homestead with a predatory stillness. And leading them, a little to the side, was Jeb, the shifty ranch hand. His face was a mixture of fear and greedy satisfaction. He had sold them for a handful of silver. "Luke!" she cried, her voice a raw scream of terror. Luke had already seen them. He was moving, his limp forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. He ran for the cabin, shouting her name. "Get down! Stay away from the window!" He burst through the door just as the first shot rang out, a loud crack that splintered the door frame where his head had been moments before. He slammed the heavy wooden bar across the door and grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall. "They're here," he said, his voice grim, his eyes scanning the single room for an escape. There was none. The cabin had only one door and one small window. It was a trap. Another shot tore through the window, shattering the glass and showering the floor with glittering shards. Eliza screamed and dropped to the floor, crawling behind the heavy wooden table. "We have to get out of here," Luke said, his mind racing. "They'll set fire to the place if they have to." He looked at the back wall, at the stone fireplace. The chimney, it's wide enough. It was a desperate, insane idea, but it was the only one they had. He helped her up, his hand a firm grip on her arm. "Go! I'll hold them off!" He fired a shot through the window, and one of the men outside yelled in pain or surprise. It would not deter them for long. Eliza scrambled into the fireplace, soot and ash dirtying her dress and hands. She found the handholds in the rough stone and began to climb, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Luke fired again, then turned and followed her, his rifle slung over his back. The chimney was dark and narrow, the rough stones scraping her skin. Above, she could see a small square of dark blue sky, pricked with the first evening stars. It was a vision of freedom. She pulled herself out onto the roof just as Luke emerged behind her. Below, they could hear the men shouting, one of them kicking at the barred door. They had to move, and they had to be quiet. They scrambled across the rough shingled roof and dropped to the ground on the far side of the cabin, landing in the soft earth of Luke's vegetable garden. The corral was their only hope. If they could get to the horse, they might have a chance. They ran, hunched low, keeping the cabin between them and the men. The sound of splintering wood told them the door was giving way. They were almost to the fence when one of the men rounded the corner of the cabin. He saw them, a dark figure against the last light of the sky. He raised his rifle. Luke shoved Eliza forward. "Run!" he yelled. The rifle cracked. A line of fire seared across Luke's left side. He grunted in pain and stumbled, but he did not fall. He kept running, pushing her toward the horse. They reached the corral, and Luke tore open the gate. Dust, panicked by the shouting and gunfire, reared and shied away. "Easy, boy, easy," Luke soothed, his voice strained with pain, his hand going to his side. It came away wet and dark in the dim light. He grabbed the horse's mane and swung himself onto its bare back, his movements clumsy with pain. He reached down and pulled Eliza up behind him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "Hold on!" he shouted. He kicked the horse into a gallop, and they burst out of the clearing, plunging into the dark woods just as the other men came running, their shots echoing uselessly behind them. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the branches of unseen trees whipping at their faces. Eliza held on tight, her cheek pressed against Luke's back. She could feel the warmth of his blood seeping through his shirt, and with every stride of the horse, she could feel him flinch in pain. Finally, when he was sure they were not being followed, he slowed the horse to a walk. He was swaying in the saddle, his strength failing. "We have to stop," he gasped, his voice thin. In a small clearing, bathed in the pale light of a rising moon, stood the skeletal remains of a burned-out barn. It was not much, but it was shelter. He slid off the horse and nearly collapsed, leaning heavily against its side. Eliza slid down after him and rushed to his side, her hands fluttering uselessly. "Let me see," she said, her voice shaking. She helped him into the dubious shelter of the ruined barn, the air thick with the smell of old smoke and damp earth. He sank to the ground, his back against a charred timber, his face pale and beaded with sweat in the moonlight. With trembling fingers, she tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her dress. She gently pulled his torn, bloody shirt away from the wound. It was a long, ugly gash along his ribs. A graze, but a deep one. The bullet had torn through flesh, but by some miracle, it seemed to have missed anything vital. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water from their canteen, her touch as gentle as a whisper. He winced, his breath hissing between his teeth, but he did not cry out. She wrapped the makeshift bandage tightly around his torso, her hands now steady, her fear replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. He had saved her. Now it was her turn to save him. When she was finished, she sat beside him in the quiet darkness of the ruined barn, their temporary, fragile sanctuary. He leaned his head back against the timber and closed his eyes, his breathing shallow but even. Outside, the crickets chirped their ageless song, and the moon climbed higher in the sky, a silent, silver witness to their desperate flight. The silence in the burned-out barn was a living thing, as profound and deep as the darkness that filled the corners the moonlight could not reach. Outside, the world was a vast, indifferent wilderness, but within the charred skeleton of the old structure, the world had shrunk to the space between two people, huddled together for warmth and solace. Luke was asleep, or perhaps just lost in a haze of pain, his breathing shallow, his head resting against her shoulder. Eliza sat perfectly still, her arms wrapped around him, as if she could hold him together with the sheer force of her will. The adrenaline of their escape had long since faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a stark, terrifying clarity. They were fugitives, hunted and wounded, with nothing but a tired horse and the clothes on their backs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every night sound was the approach of Silas's men. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a constant companion in the darkness. But as she sat there, listening to the steady, if shallow, rhythm of Luke's breathing, another feeling began to surface, one that was stronger than fear. It was a fierce, protective tenderness that made her ache. He had taken a bullet for her. He had stood between her and the ugliness of the world, and now he was broken because of it. After a time, his eyes fluttered open. He looked up at her, his face pale in the moonlight that streamed through the gaping holes in the roof. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice rough with pain. "I am not going anywhere," she said softly, her hand coming up to brush a stray piece of hair from his forehead. Her touch was hesitant, gentle. He shifted, a grimace of pain flashing across his face as the movement pulled at his wound. "You should have kept going. Taken the horse. You'd be safer alone." "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "There is no safety for me alone. You are the only safety I have found in this entire land." She looked away, her gaze falling on the dark, empty spaces of the ruined barn. "I feel like a ghost. Luke, a person with no name and no place. I do not belong to him anymore, but I do not belong anywhere else. I'm afraid I will spend the rest of my life, however short it may be, never truly belonging to anyone or any place at all." Her confession hung in the silent air, a raw and vulnerable admission of the profound loneliness that had been her life's defining truth. She expected him to say something practical, to talk of his cousin or their plans to reach the mining town, but he did not. He reached up, his hand surprisingly strong, and cupped her jaw, turning her face back to his. His gray eyes, dark with pain and something deeper, held hers. "You already belong with me," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the terrifying uncertainty of her world. The words were simple, but they struck her with the force of a revelation. It was not a claim of ownership, not the branding of a man like Silas. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of shared space, of mutual acceptance. "You belong with me, here, now, in this ruin, in this darkness." It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. Tears she did not know she had left to cry welled in her eyes and traced silent paths through the dirt and soot on her cheeks. He watched them fall, his expression softening, and then he pulled her closer, a gentle pressure that invited her to lean down. She did, her heart a wild, frantic thing in her chest, and she met his lips. This kiss was different from the first. It was not a kiss of solace, but of discovery. It was a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death, a shared warmth against the cold. They were two solitary souls, two people who had been broken by the world in different ways, and in that moment, they found in each other a completeness they had never known. The loneliness that had defined both of their lives began to recede, pushed back by the simple, profound act of two people choosing to hold on to each other in the dark. She lay down beside him on the hard-packed earth, her body curled against his uninjured side. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. There was no passion in their union, not in the way the world understood it. There was no breathless haste or fiery demand. It was a quiet, desperate coming together, a slow and reverent exploration of touch and closeness. It was a yearning to feel alive, to feel safe, to erase the phantom touch of cruel hands and the memory of cold, empty beds. It was a silent vow, made not with words, but with a shared breath, a gentle touch, a meeting of bodies that was more about healing than it was about desire, in the ruins of a forgotten barn, surrounded by a world that wanted to tear them apart. They made a sanctuary out of each other, a fragile, temporary home built on a foundation of shared pain and a desperate, burgeoning hope. They left at the first hint of dawn, a gray, watery light that promised another day of unforgiving heat. Luke was weak, his movements slow and pained, but his will was a thing of iron. He refused to let her see the full extent of his suffering, pulling himself onto the horse's back with a quiet grunt of effort. Eliza climbed up behind him, her arms once again wrapped around his waist, her body a shield for his, her mind a watchful guardian. They traveled toward the distant, hazy shapes of the mountains, their destination a mining town called Redemption, a name that felt like a bitter joke. The land they passed through was a testament to failure and loss. They rode through a ghost town, its empty buildings staring at them with vacant, windowless eyes, the saloon doors swinging on creaking hinges in the wind, a mournful welcome to a place where all dreams had died. They passed a ranch that had been burned to the ground, only the stone chimney left standing like a lonely tombstone, a stark reminder of the violence that had driven them from their own small sanctuary. The landscape was their own lives writ large, a place of ruins, of desperate journeys, of hungry coyotes that they could hear yipping in the hills at dusk, their cries a perfect echo of the predatory world that was hunting them. They were in limbo, trapped between a past that was trying to kill them and a future that did not yet exist. They reached redemption in the late afternoon. It was not a town. It was a wound on the face of the earth, a chaotic collection of tents, clapboard shacks, and a few solid buildings huddled along a muddy, rutted street. The air was thick with the dust of the mines, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the sound of a tinny piano from a crowded saloon. Men were everywhere, hard, grimy men with pickaxes over their shoulders and pistols on their hips. Their eyes, when they fell on Eliza, were hungry and assessing, and she instinctively pressed herself closer to Luke, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. Luke's cousin, Amos, ran the town's small livery stable. They found it at the far end of the street, a ramshackle building that smelled of hay and horse sweat. Luke slid off dust, his face ashen, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He stumbled, and Eliza was there to catch him, her arm a steady support. "Stay here with the horse," he said, his voice strained. "I'll find Amos." She watched him walk toward the stable, his steps unsteady, his hand pressed to his side. She saw two men detach themselves from the crowd in front of the saloon and begin to follow him, their movements too casual, their eyes too focused. They were Silas's men. She knew it with a certainty that was a cold shard of ice in her gut. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice lost in the din of the town. He heard her, or perhaps he sensed the danger. He turned just as the two men closed in on him. One of them drew a long, wicked-looking knife. The other lunged for him. What happened next was a blur of brutal, desperate motion. Luke, weak as he was, moved with a surprising, deadly speed. He sidestepped the lunge and brought his elbow up hard into the first man's throat, sending him staggering backward, choking and gasping. The second man came at him with the knife, a low, vicious slash aimed at his stomach. Luke caught the man's wrist, his grip like a steel trap. For a moment, they were locked in a desperate struggle, two figures straining against each other in the dusty street. Luke twisted, using the man's own momentum against him, and slammed the man's knife hand against the rough corner of a watering trough. The man howled in pain and the knife clattered to the ground. Luke drove his knee into the man's gut, and he collapsed, retching into the mud. It was over in seconds, but it had cost him. He stood, swaying, over the two fallen men. His shirt, on his left side, was now soaked with a fresh, bright crimson. He had torn the wound open in the struggle, and this time, it was worse, much worse. He looked at Eliza, his eyes glazed with pain, and then his legs buckled, and he fell to his knees in the street. For a single, paralyzing moment, Eliza was frozen. The girl from Boston, the fragile bride who knew nothing of this world of mud and blood and brutal violence. But then that girl died, and a new woman was born in her place. A woman forged in a dark cellar, tempered in a desperate flight, and hardened by the sight of the man who had saved her, bleeding in the street. She ran to him, not screaming, not crying, but with a cold, focused rage that burned away all fear. She knelt beside him, her hands going to the new wound. It was deep, a gaping tear that was bleeding freely. "Help me!" she shouted to the crowd of miners that had gathered to watch the spectacle, their faces a mixture of curiosity and indifference. No one moved. "Damn you all, help me!" she roared, her voice the crack of a whip. An old man with a kind, weathered face finally stepped forward from the doorway of the livery. "Bring him in here, miss," he said. It was Amos, Luke's cousin. Together, they half-dragged, half-carried Luke into the dim, hay-scented interior of the stable and laid him on a pile of clean straw in an empty stall. Amos brought a lantern, a bucket of water, and a roll of clean bandages. "He's lost a lot of blood," Amos said, his voice grim. "The doc in this town is a drunk and a butcher. You'd be better off doing it yourself." Eliza looked at the terrible wound, at Luke's pale, unconscious face. The thought of putting a needle to his flesh made her feel sick, but the thought of losing him was infinitely worse. "I will need a needle and strong thread," she said, her voice a calm, steady thing that did not sound like her own. "And whiskey. For him. And for cleaning the needle." Amos nodded and disappeared, returning moments later with what she had asked for. She poured some of the whiskey onto a clean rag and wiped the blood from the wound, her movements precise and sure. She threaded the needle, her hands surprisingly steady. "Luke," she said softly, leaning close to his ear. "Luke, this is going to hurt, but I will not leave you. Do you hear me? I will not leave you." She took a deep breath and pushed the needle through his skin. His body arched in a silent scream of agony, and then he went limp again. She worked quickly, her focus absolute. Her world narrowed to the small, bloody landscape of his wound and the task of closing it. She stitched him up with small, neat stitches, her mind a cold, clear instrument, her heart a hot, painful knot in her chest. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly and collapsed beside him in the straw, her body trembling with the aftermath of her ordeal. Amos had found a wagon, a rickety but sturdy vehicle, and hitched up a horse. "My cabin's a few miles up in the hills," he said. "You'll be safe there for a while. No one will find you." They moved Luke into the back of the wagon, making him as comfortable as they could on a bed of blankets. Eliza climbed in beside him, refusing to leave his side. As Amos took the reins and guided the wagon out of the chaotic, violent town and into the quiet of the surrounding hills, Eliza cradled Luke's head in her lap. They reached the cabin, a small, isolated dwelling tucked away in a pine-scented valley. Just as the moon was rising, they got Luke inside and into a proper bed. Amos gave her a salve for the wound and promised to return with food the next day. Then he left them alone. Eliza sat by the bed, watching Luke sleep, his face peaceful in the soft lamplight. She had done it. She had faced down a street full of hostile strangers, stitched a man's wound, and brought him to safety. A strange sense of peace settled over her. They were alive. They were safe. For now. But as the peace settled, something else began to stir within her. A cold, hard anger. A rage that was different from the helpless fury she had felt in Silas's house. This was a rage born of strength, not weakness. She had run from Silas, and he had sent his hounds after her. She had found a moment of peace with Luke, and the world had torn it away. She realized then, with a chilling certainty, that running was not enough. Running was not freedom. It was just a different kind of cage, a life spent looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next attack. As long as Silas Croft was out there, with his money and his power, she would never be safe. Luke would never be safe. And what about the next girl her father, or some other man, might sell? What about the next ranch hand who would be beaten for a small mistake? The world had taught her a harsh lesson. To be gentle in a brutal world was to be a victim. She would not be a victim anymore. The fight was not over. It had just begun, and this time, she would not be the one running. She would be the one who fought back. For 3 weeks, Luke's life was a fragile thing held in Eliza's hands. She tended to him in the quiet solitude of Amos's cabin, her days measured by the rhythm of his breathing. She learned the landscape of his pain, the subtle grimace that meant the wound was pulling, the sheen of sweat on his brow that signaled the onset of a fever. She changed his bandages, cleaned the angry, stitched line on his torso, and spooned broth between his lips when he was too weak to feed himself. In the long, quiet nights, she would sit by his bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest in the lamplight, and a fierce, terrifying love took root in her heart. He was her world, this small, quiet cabin his entire kingdom, and she was its sole, vigilant guardian. As his strength returned, so did their conversations. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, his gray eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. They spoke of small things, the taste of the wild herbs she gathered for soup, the way the light changed on the mountainsides throughout the day. They did not speak of Silas, or of the men who had hunted them. That world felt 1,000,000 miles away, but they both knew it was just outside the door, waiting. The rage that had been born in her on the day of the ambush did not cool. It settled, hardening from a blazing fire into a core of cold, hard steel. She had run, and Luke had been hurt. She had hidden, and they had been found. She understood now that there was no mountain high enough, no valley remote enough, to hide from a man like Silas. He would never stop. To be free, she could not simply run from her past. She had to destroy it. One morning, when Luke was finally able to sit up on his own, his color returning, the wound beginning to scar over, she knew it was time. She waited until he had fallen into a deep, healing sleep. Then, with a hand that did not tremble, she wrote him a short note, leaving it on the small table beside his bed. "I am not running anymore. I am going to finish this. Wait for me." She signed it simply, Eliza. She took the small pouch of money Luke had set aside for their escape, put on the sturdiest pair of boots Amos had left for her, and slipped out of the cabin into the pre-dawn chill. She walked the few miles back to the mining town, a solitary, determined figure on a dusty road. Amos found her at the livery, her face set and pale. He took one look at her and did not argue. He had seen that look in men going off to war. "I need a disguise," she said, her voice low and steady. "And a ticket for the eastbound stage, the one that passes through Oak Creek." "That's Silas Croft's town," he said, his voice a worried rumble. "It's suicide, girl." "It is the only way," she answered. Amos, a man who understood the hard necessities of survival, sighed and nodded. From a dusty trunk, he produced a set of clothes, a severe, high-collared dress of black bombazine, a matching black bonnet, and a thick veil. They had belonged to his late wife. Eliza changed into them, the unfamiliar fabric stiff and formal. She pulled her hair back into a tight, severe bun, a style that made her look older, harsher. Looking at her reflection in a piece of cracked mirror, she barely recognized herself. The soft, frightened bride was gone. In her place was a widow, a woman cloaked in grief and shadow. It was the perfect armor. The stagecoach ride was a rattling, dust-choked journey back into the heart of her own private hell. But this time, she was not a terrified girl being delivered to her fate. She was a hunter, returning to the place where the beast made its lair. When she stepped down in the familiar, dusty street of Oak Creek, no one gave the solemn, black-clad widow a second glance. She was invisible. Her first stop was the Croft Ranch. She did not go near the main house. She went to the small outbuilding where the household servants slept. She found Maria hanging laundry on a line, her movements slow and tired, her face etched with a familiar fear. Eliza lifted her veil. Maria gasped, her eyes wide with terror, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. "Hush," Eliza said softly, her voice urgent. "Do not be afraid. I am not here to cause trouble for you. I need your help." Maria looked around frantically, certain that Silas's men would appear at any moment. "You should not be here, Senora," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He is a devil. He will kill you." "He will if I do not stop him first," Eliza said, her gaze firm. "Maria, you know what he is. You have seen it. I need proof. Anything you can find. Ledgers, letters. Anything that shows his business dealings. Anything that seems wrong." Seeing the steel in Eliza's eyes, a courage she had never possessed herself, Maria's fear gave way to a flicker of hope. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She told Eliza of the small study where Silas kept his books, a room that was always locked. She told her of the nights she heard him in there, muttering to himself, and of the faint smell of strange chemicals. She promised to look for the key. Eliza's next visit was to the saloon. It was early afternoon, and the place was mostly empty, smelling of stale beer and regret. She found the woman she was looking for polishing glasses behind the bar. Her name was Sadie, a woman with hard, knowing eyes and hair the color of faded gold. Eliza had seen her in town before, had seen the way Silas looked at her when he thought his new wife was not watching. Eliza sat at the bar, a silent figure in black. Sadie approached her, her expression wary. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" she asked. "I am here about Silas Croft," Eliza said, her voice low and even, her face still hidden by the veil. Sadie's face hardened. "I don't know anything about Mr. Croft." "I think you do," Eliza said. "I know he promised you things. I know he paid for your time. And I know he cast you aside when he was done with you. I am here to see him pay for what he has done, to you and to others." Sadie stared at her for a long moment. Then her facade of indifference cracked. A bitter, resentful light came into her eyes. "He's a snake," she spat. "A charming snake, but a snake all the same. He promised me a little house, a life away from this place. All lies." Sadie told her everything. She told her of the other ranchers Silas had befriended, men he had plied with whiskey and cards. She told of how he had boasted of his cleverness, of acquiring deeds to land for a fraction of their worth from men who were too drunk or too desperate to know better. She gave Eliza names. A man named Henderson, who had lost his family's ranch in a card game. A young homesteader named Miller, whose water rights had been stolen through a forged document. Armed with these names, Eliza found the final piece of her puzzle. She went to the office of Mr. Gable, the town's only lawyer, a fussy, nervous man with ink-stained fingers. At first, he was dismissive, unwilling to speak of his client's business. But Eliza was persistent. She laid out what she knew, the names Sadie had given her, the hints of forgery that Maria had uncovered. "My marriage to Mr. Croft," she said, her voice cold and clear, "was not a marriage. It was a business transaction. It gave him an air of respectability, a legal foothold in this community that he used to defraud his neighbors. I believe my signature has been forged on documents I have never seen, documents that legitimized his theft." Mr. Gable, seeing the web of deceit laid bare before him, and perhaps fearing his own unwitting complicity, finally relented. He confirmed her suspicions. Silas had used his marriage to Eliza, a woman from a respected Eastern family, as a shield. He had consolidated his stolen lands under the Croft name, a name now legally shared by Eliza, making his holdings seem larger and more legitimate than they were. The fraud was extensive, a cancer that had spread throughout the county. She had it. She had the proof. A circuit judge was due to arrive in town that week, a man named Pettigrew, who dispensed justice from a makeshift courtroom in the very saloon where she had been married. This was her chance. She gathered her evidence, a sworn statement from Sadie, a list of discrepancies from Mr. Gable, and a small, leather-bound ledger that Maria had managed to sneak out of Silas's study, filled with figures that did not add up and pages where he had clearly been practicing forging other men's signatures. On the day the court was in session, Eliza entered the saloon, no longer a shadowy widow, but a woman with a purpose. She pushed back her veil, and a murmur went through the crowd of dusty ranchers and townsfolk as they recognized the runaway bride. She walked to the front, her head held high, and stood before the tired, impatient-looking judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the room. "I am Eliza Croft, and I am here to accuse my husband, Silas Croft, of fraud, theft, and conspiracy." She laid out her case, her voice never wavering. She spoke of the stolen land, the forged documents, the lives that had been ruined by Silas's greed. She presented the ledger, the statements, the evidence of a far-reaching criminal enterprise. When she was finished, a stunned silence fell over the room. The men Silas had cheated looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning fury. Judge Pettigrew listened, his expression impassive. He looked at the ledger, at the papers, and then he looked at Eliza. His gaze was not one of admiration for her courage, but of weary condescension. "This is a serious accusation, Madam," he said, his voice dry. "It is the truth, Your Honor," she replied. The judge sighed and leaned back in his chair. He looked out at the sea of faces, then back at her. "You are a wife, Madam," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Under the law, your identity is bound to that of your husband. You have no standing apart from him. Any property, any dispute, is his to manage. This is a domestic squabble, a matter for a husband to settle with his hysterical wife. It is not a matter for this court." He banged his gavel on the table. "Case dismissed." The words were a physical blow. The system she had placed her faith in, the law she had believed would bring justice, had slammed the door in her face. She was, as the judge had said, just a woman. Her proof meant nothing. Her voice meant nothing. The crowd began to mutter, some with sympathy, most with a shrugging acceptance of the way things were. Silas had won. That night, as she sat in the small boarding house room she had rented, a numb despair washing over her. They came for her. 2 of Silas's men, the same men who had ambushed them at the mining town. They kicked the door in without a word and grabbed her, their hands rough and bruising. They dragged her into the street, threw her over a horse, and rode hard for the Croft Ranch. They brought her to him in the very parlor where she had spent so many silent, lonely evenings. Silas was standing by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. "Did you really think it would be so easy?" he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Did you think you could ruin me with the babbling of a saloon girl and a frightened lawyer? This is my town. Eliza, my world. You live in it by my permission." He took a step toward her. "Now, you are going to learn your place once and for all. You are my wife. You will return to my house, to my bed, and you will learn to be obedient." He reached for her, his hand closing around her arm in a grip of iron. He began to drag her toward the staircase, and in that moment, as his fingers dug into her flesh, another memory rose up, blotting out the fear. It was the memory of a different touch, of a different man. It was the memory of Luke's hands framing her face, his quiet voice whispering, "I only saved you to hold you like this." The contrast was a lightning strike to her soul. Silas's grip was ownership. Luke's embrace was sanctuary. Silas's touch was a cage. Luke's was freedom. A primal scream of rage tore from her throat. She twisted in his grip, her nails raking across his face, drawing blood. He swore, his surprise momentarily loosening his hold, and she wrenched her arm free. She did not run for the door. She ran for the fireplace. A kerosene lamp sat on the mantel. She seized it, her movements a blur of desperate energy. She threw it at the heavy velvet curtains that covered the parlor window. The glass shattered, and the kerosene-soaked fabric erupted in a sudden, violent whoosh of flame. Silas stared, his face a mask of disbelief. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking up the dry curtains, catching on the wooden window frame. Smoke began to fill the room. Eliza did not wait to watch it burn. She ran. She burst out of the house, the shouts of Silas and his men echoing behind her. In the confusion, no one tried to stop her. She ran to the stables, her lungs burning, the smell of smoke in her hair. She found Silas's own horse, a powerful black stallion, already saddled. She tore the reins free, swung herself onto its back, and kicked it into a wild gallop, away from the burning house, away from the life that had been her prison. Meanwhile, Luke had woken to an empty cabin and a note that was both a promise and a terror. For a day, he had honored her request, trusting in her strength, his body still too weak to follow. But by the second day, a gnawing fear had consumed him. He could not let her face Silas alone. Amos had brought him a horse and a rifle, though he was far from healed, his wound a dull, throbbing ache in his side. Luke had set out, his tracker's eyes searching the dusty road for any sign of her. He found the trail of the stagecoach, followed it to Oak Creek, and heard the whispers in the town of the bride's return, of her shocking accusation in the saloon, of the judge's dismissal. A cold dread had seized him. He knew Silas would not let such a public defiance go unpunished. He rode for the ranch, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw the orange glow in the sky from a mile away. He spurred his horse onward, his mind a maelstrom of terrible possibilities. Had they hurt her? Was she trapped in that inferno? He found her on the road just outside of town, a solitary figure on a black horse, silhouetted against the rising moon. The inferno of the ranch house cast a demonic glow on the horizon behind her. Her face was streaked with soot. Her hair was a wild tangle. Her dress was torn. She looked exhausted, haunted, and utterly, magnificently alive. He reined in his horse beside her. She looked at him, and the hard warrior's mask on her face crumbled, revealing the vulnerable, weary woman beneath. A single silent tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He did not need to ask what had happened. He simply reached out and, with a strength he did not know he possessed, lifted her from her saddle and into his arms, settling her in front of him. She collapsed against his chest, her body trembling with the aftermath of her ordeal, and buried her face in his shoulder. He held her close, the familiar, solid feel of her a balm to his own frayed soul. He could feel the old wedding ring on her finger, a cold, hard circle against his skin. "You didn't need to give me your ring," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Just stay." They rode through the night, leaving the angry orange glow of the burning ranch behind them. The world was quiet again. The only sounds, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Luke held Eliza, his arms a circle of unwavering strength around her, and she leaned back against his chest, drawing from his warmth, his solid, reassuring presence. She was exhausted, a weariness so profound it went past bone and muscle and settled deep in her soul. But for the first time, she felt the first fragile seed of freedom. It was not a grand, soaring feeling. It was a quiet, trembling thing, a single point of light in a vast darkness. They did not stop until they reached the safety of Amos's cabin in the hills. For 2 days, they did nothing but rest. Luke's wound, though not fully healed, was holding, and his strength was returning. Eliza slept, long and deep, her mind finally allowing itself to let go of the constant, vigilant fear she had lived with for so long. They spoke little, their communication a thing of shared glances, of hands that found each other in the quiet of the evening. They were in a cocoon, a temporary reprieve from the world. But Eliza knew it was not over. The fire had destroyed a building, a symbol of her imprisonment. But it had not destroyed the lies. Silas was ruined financially. His web of deceit burned to ash along with his fine house. But his influence, the power of his name and his lies, still poisoned the air of Oak Creek. She was legally free. A wife abandoned by a fleeing husband was no longer bound. But she did not feel safe. She would not be truly free until she had reclaimed her name, until she had spoken her truth not to a dismissive judge, but to the people who had stood by and watched her suffer. "I have to go back," she said one evening, as they sat outside the cabin, watching the stars ignite in the deep purple sky. Luke looked at her, his face serious in the twilight. "There is nothing for you back there. Eliza, let it go. We can go anywhere. Start new." "It is not for them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is for me. And it is for the next woman some man decides to treat like property. It is for the next boy some powerful man decides to beat for sport. If people like Silas are allowed to just disappear into the shadows, then the shadows will eventually swallow everyone. The people in that town, they knew something was wrong, and they looked away. I want them to look at me. I want them to see what they chose not to see before. Luke saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes, the same steel that had allowed her to survive the desert, to stitch his wound, to burn her prison to the ground. This was not the fragile woman he had found near death. This was a warrior. He would not stand in her way. "Then I will go with you," he said simply. Their return to Oak Creek was nothing like her previous arrivals. They rode in together, side by side, not as fugitives, but as a united front. The town was in an uproar. The news of the fire had spread, and with it, 1,000 rumors. When Eliza and Luke dismounted in front of the saloon, a hush fell over the street. People stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, reluctant respect. The saloon was crowded, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and nervous sweat. The failed court session had left an ugly stain on the town's conscience, and Eliza's dramatic act of defiance had forced them all to look at their own cowardice. She and Luke walked through the swinging doors, and the room fell silent. At a table in the corner sat Silas. He was not the confident, arrogant man he had been. His face, scratched and blistered from the fire, was pale and drawn. His clothes were singed. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting around the room, finding no friendly faces. He had lost everything, and now he was surrounded by the men he had cheated, the people who had once feared him and now only despised him. Eliza did not address him. She walked to the center of the room, Luke a silent, solid presence at her side, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip, a clear warning to anyone who might think to interfere. She stood on the same spot where she'd been married, the same spot where the judge had dismissed her. But this time, she was not a bride for sale, nor a petitioner begging for justice. She was the judge, and this was her courtroom. She looked at the faces around her, meeting the eyes of the ranchers, the merchants, the women she had seen in town, their expressions a mixture of guilt and curiosity. "My name is Eliza," she began, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I am not a Croft. I am not a madwoman. I am not a harlot. I am the woman you all watched be sold to that man in this very room." She pointed a single, steady finger at Silas, who flinched as if she had struck him. "You saw the bruises he tried to hide," she said, her voice rising with a passion born of righteous anger. "You saw the fear in my eyes when I walked down that street. You heard the stories, the whispers of his cruelty. You saw, and you did nothing. You looked away, because it was easier, because his money and his power made you cowards." A murmur of shame rippled through the crowd. Men shuffled their feet and looked at the floor. "He did not just try to destroy me," Eliza continued. "He tried to destroy you." She looked at a grizzled rancher she recognized as Henderson, a man whose face was a roadmap of hardship. "Mr. Henderson, he took your father's land in a crooked card game, did he not?" Henderson, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and anger, slowly nodded. "He did," the man choked out. "Got me drunk and cheated me blind." She turned to another man. "And Mr. Miller, he forged your name on a deed and stole the rights to your creek, leaving your family without water, did he not?" The young homesteader looked up, his eyes burning with a renewed sense of injustice. "He did," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "That snake, he ruined us." One by one, the stories came out, a flood of resentment and anger that had been held back by fear for too long. The townsfolk, moved by Eliza's courage and ashamed of their own silence, finally turned. The collective weight of their guilt and fury settled on one man. The room, which had once been Silas's kingdom, now became his cage. The fear he had cultivated for so long had vanished, replaced by a cold, universal contempt. Silas saw the look in their eyes. He saw the hatred, the disgust. There was no escape. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He looked at Eliza, his face a mask of pure, venomous hatred. Then, without a word, he turned and fled, pushing his way through the crowd and out the swinging doors. No one tried to stop him. They just watched him go, a ruined man running from the ghosts of his own making. 3 days later, a trapper riding in from the north brought the news. They had found a body in the shallow, muddy waters of the Red Creek, miles from town. It was Silas Croft. Whether he had slipped and fallen in a desperate, panicked flight, or whether he had chosen a coward's end in the cold water, no one knew. Some whispered that justice had a long memory and a heavy hand, and that perhaps one of the men he had wronged had followed him and settled the score. No one investigated too closely. Oak Creek was content to let the river keep its secrets. For Eliza, the news was not a moment of triumph, but of quiet, final release. The last chain had been broken. She was free. They did not stay in Oak Creek. The town and its memories were a part of a life that no longer belonged to her. They rode north, away from the low, dusty plains and into the high country, where the air was clean and the sky felt closer. They found a piece of land, a forgotten homestead nestled in a valley just outside the county line, a place where no one knew their names, a place where they could build a world of their own. The first year was hard. They lived in the old, run-down cabin that had come with the land, its walls letting in the winter wind. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching, their hands raw, but it was a good kind of ache, the ache of creation, of building something that was theirs, together. They repaired the cabin, their hammers ringing in the clear mountain air. They cleared the fields, pulling up stubborn sagebrush and rocks, their sweat watering the rich, dark earth. They built fences, their hands working in easy, practiced rhythm, stringing wire that defined the boundaries of their new life. Eliza blossomed in that high, lonely country. The delicate, fragile bride from Boston was a distant memory, a ghost of another woman. This new Eliza was sunburned and strong, her body lean and capable from long days of hard work. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now calloused and competent. She learned to plant crops, to feel the promise of life in a handful of seeds. She learned to ride a cattle trail, her seat in the saddle as sure and steady as any man's, her quiet voice able to calm a nervous herd. She had shed the skin of the woman she was supposed to be and had grown into the woman she truly was. The land had not broken her. It had revealed her. Luke watched her, a quiet pride and a deep, abiding love shining in his eyes. The haunted, solitary man who had found her in the desert was also healing. The walls he had built around his heart had crumbled, and the quiet joy of their shared life had filled the empty spaces. He had found in her a reason to trust the world again, or at least, this small corner of it they had made their own. One quiet evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a warm, golden glow over their small valley, they sat by the fire they had built in front of their now sturdy cabin. A comfortable silence settled between them, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the distant call of a night bird. Eliza had been quiet for a long time, her gaze lost in the fire. She looked at her left hand, at the plain, heavy gold band that she still wore. It no longer felt like a shackle. It was just a piece of metal, a relic from a dead past. With a slow, deliberate movement, she twisted the ring and slid it off her finger. It left a pale, naked line on her tanned skin. She held it out to him in the palm of her hand, the gold gleaming in the firelight.
"I offered this to you once as payment,"
she said, her voice soft. "Now, I offer it to you as a choice." Luke looked at the ring lying in her palm, a symbol of vows and laws, of a world that had tried to own and define her. Then he looked at her face, at the strong, confident, beautiful woman who sat beside him, a woman who was bound to him by something far stronger than any piece of metal. He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached his eyes. He closed her fingers over the ring, his hand warm and steady over hers.
I don't want that,
he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble.
Just stay close.
She let the ring drop, forgotten, to the ground. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his side. They sat there for a long time, watching the flames dance, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined. There were no vows, no gold, just two scarred souls who had walked through fire and found their way home. Two people who had been saved, not by grand gestures, but by the quiet, constant, unwavering choice to simply stay, to hold on to each other in the darkness, again and again. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our Wild West Campfire channel, and feel free to share your thoughts in English.